Greetings to everyone and a warm welcome to this fellowship of minds in which we examine fundamental realities of life in order to cultivate clarity about it. In this video, our focus is on love, which is quite understandably the most fundamental, essential, as well as divine experience in human life. There is nothing that a human being desires more deeply than the blessed state of being loved. But according to Mother Teresa, there is a state higher than this, and that is the state of loving. Most people in this world want to be loved without accepting the responsibility to love. In the spiritual vision of Jesus Christ, the eligibility for being loved depends on the capacity to love. Only if we love do we develop the merit to be loved. Now, you will quite rightly ask me, what does love mean? I have to say that I don't have a neat and handsome definition of love, but I do have a working understanding of love. And that's what I propose to share through this video, in the hope that you will find this useful, provided you're willing to examine yourself in the light of the simple things that I include as a spiritual vision of love in this video. Perhaps the most central and essential statement I can make about the nature of love or what love involves is that love is a state in which a human being discovers himself or herself in another. I have to acknowledge that I got this insight from Hegel. It's not my original idea. Let me repeat that statement. It's a very cryptic, packed statement. We'll try and understand it in our own way. Love is the experience in which a human being discovers himself or herself in another. Alongside this, let me also put a statement by a lesser-known Russian philosopher. His name is Vladimir Solovyov. He's not at all known in India. I discovered Solovyov because of my interest in Dostoevsky. Solovyov is the philosopher, a Russian philosopher who influenced Dostoevsky greatly, more than perhaps most others. Now, in his book, The Meaning of Love, Solovyov says that love is the experience in which the individual shifts the center of his being, the focus, the nucleus of his being, the core of his being, onto another. Or to put it in simple spiritual language, love is the purest experience of self-transcendence in the positive sense of going out of oneself in order to regain oneself in an enriched manner through a deep association, selfless, profound and spiritual association with another human being. It's also akin to the mystery that Jesus talks about in the 12th chapter of John's Gospel. He who loses his life for my sake shall find it. Here the idea of losing one's life is the idea that Hegel formulates as going out of oneself in order to discover oneself in another. So, he who loses his life for my sake means he who shifts, and I'm going to use the words of Solovyov, he who shifts the center or focus or core of his life into the person of Jesus. And that's the idea of loving God, loving Jesus, loving God through Jesus. Without this shifting of the self, without this positive spiritual self-denial, which is different from self-denigration or the abandonment of the self as a burden, etc. It's a very positive, affirmative, and profound, proactive experience, dynamic experience of relocating the focus of life from oneself onto another and into another. And this is the idea that Jesus expresses in the 4th verse of the 15th chapter of John's Gospel, abide in me and I in you. So we shift the core or the essence of our being into the person of Jesus, and Jesus deposits or Jesus pours the spirit or the essence of his being into us. And that's an amazingly blessed state, as is very easy and obvious to see. So this is the spiritual state. This is the idea of love that we find both in the teachings of Jesus Christ and in the understanding of many philosophers who have been influenced by Jesus. I don't think that either Hegel or Vladimir Solovyov or a writer like Erich Fromm would have written, or Søren Kierkegaard, the works of love, would have written what they have written, would have got the insights that they have shared with us without the light of Jesus. Jesus' influence is far more pervasive than we realize. But that's not my main theme here. It may not divert from the theme of love. So what we've seen so far is, and I'm going to stick to the simple definition, simple but profound definition given by Hegel, love is the experience of discovering oneself in another. All right. Now, therefore, love involves or presupposes a prior division. In order to shift the focus of one's being into another, the person who does so has to be different from the person to whom the core of one's essence is shifted. So there is a division, there is a difference. But this difference is for a purpose. This difference is meant for the enlargement of the scope of love and its many-sided enrichment. Now let me explain. Now suppose you are in love with someone else. Say a man is in love with a woman. If you're a young man, you're in love with a beautiful girl, a girl of kindred spirit, a girl who is in spiritual affinity. I'm not using the word spiritual in a kind of pietistic or religious sense, in a human sense. So a girl who is in spiritual affinity or an existential affinity with you. Now, you were not in that state from your birth onwards. You grew up separately, different circumstances, different ways, and you developed yourself differently, quite naturally, because you grew up in different ways. Your experiences and exposures were different. The influences that acted upon you were different. The nurtures that you got were different, so on and so forth, all kinds of differences. Now, what is the positive spiritual purpose of these differences? Before I go into that, I have to tell you that the worldly idea of difference is a purely negative one, unfortunately. Especially today, more and more, as people move away from God and the divine discipline, they become incapable of living with differences, which is a punishment in itself. Unfortunately, India is being infected by this spiritual disease, not this communal disease, and we are all going to suffer. India is going to be crippled because of this. It's a huge theme. I can only flag it for your continued investigation, reflection, and understanding. So, I said that in love, two people who grew up differently and therefore have developed differently come together and they shift the course or the essences of their beings into each other, and through that experience they become one in love. This much is clear. Now let me say a few words about the importance of differences. It is necessary, it is vital that the two individuals who enter this blessed experience of loving one another or experience of mutual love, spiritually sound mutual love, as against exploitative parasitical relationships that are sometimes mistaken for love relationship. A vast majority of love relationships in this world do not have love as their characteristic or distinguishing mark. They are simply arrangements of mutual manipulation and mutual exploitation. However, now if a young man and a young woman who have grown up differently enter into this blessed state of being in true love, it is a great advantage and a great source of enrichment that they have developed differently. Why is that so? In fact, you would think that what I am saying contradicts common sense. The worldly understanding or the assumption that prevails everywhere is that a young man and a young woman will get along brilliantly and eminently and eternally if they are carbon copies of each other. I can't think of an assumption more stupid than this. They'll get tired of each other in no time. The sameness is nothing but the breeding ground of boredom, and it's this sameness that actually eventually disappoints everyone. So it's extremely beneficial and useful for love relationships to have differences. But what kind of differences? Now, suppose a young man A falls in love with a young woman B. This young man A has developed himself in a multifarious fashion, has developed himself in the many aspects of his being, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, culturally, in terms of skills, and in terms of a whole host of interests, possibilities. And through it all, he has attained a higher level of personality development, many-sided personality development. Likewise, this young woman he is falling in love with has developed herself in the manner that this young man has, many-sided, multifarious ways, a diversity of interests, skills, and has attained that higher quality of personality. And so two such individuals are entering into this blessed union of love. What happens then? Now, being in love actually means being in contact. Being in contact. Unfortunately, when the scope of love is reduced, and the scope of love is reduced when personality development becomes just one-sided, as happens, for example, in a society of specialization. Now, you would notice, for example, that those who are in IT industry are at greater risk of relationships, conjugal relationships breaking down. There's a reason for it. The reason is that this IT industry takes the life out of those who are working in it. Of course, they are rewarded handsomely, they are paid handsomely, but in the process, they are solely sucked out of them. They don't develop. They develop only in respect of just one thing, and that's a skill for doing the IT industry work. They fail to develop any aspect of their personality. This is also unfortunately true about those who specialize in other areas like medicine, engineering, whatever. And therefore you find that these specialists somehow are poor in human terms. I remember reading in a book by Erich Fromm, I can't give you the exact title, probably it is The Anatomy of Destructiveness. He says that there was a very prestigious study conducted in the United States. That study comprised interviewing in depth of 256 chief executives of very top multinational corporations, high-end executives, corporate monarchs as it were. And he found that the results of that study proved that only 5% of them had the minimum human development. They were highly developed in the skills that were required for their corporate work, otherwise they wouldn't have reached where they have. But humanly they were all so poor. Only 5% of the 256 chief executives studied had the minimum human development. These are all very, very startling realities which are unfortunately swept under the carpet. It's time that we acquire the courage to look them in the face. So, when such a person, for example, such an executive, enters into a relationship with somebody, obviously that person will have very few points of contact. In fact, there may not be a point of contact at all. Therefore, how will that relationship survive? So it's endured for a while in a kind of practical, mechanical manner, matter-of-fact manner. Then it is discarded and something else is begun. And that's the reason why relationships keep very poorly in the corporate sector and in context of specializations. So the point I'm making is, now in order to understand this, let me use an analogy, and I'm going to use the analogy that Hegel himself uses. Hegel uses the analogy of a person immersing himself in the sea. He says when a person immerses himself in sea, the sea envelops him. And every point of his body is in contact with the sea. So there are innumerable points of contact between the body and the sea. As a result, the person forgets the world. In that state of immersion, there is only one reality, and that's the sea that surrounds him. So he says, enduring human relationships must be ideally of this kind. Of course, we can't develop in terms of every cell in our body, every part of our body, of our being, because human possibilities are so vast, so limitless. At least we must make it a point to develop our personality in terms of multiple faculties, multiple possibilities, which abound in our life. And when two people who have bothered to develop themselves in this multifarious fashion enter into a relationship of love, then that relationship becomes immensely rich, and that richness is strong enough to sustain, to uphold, to bear up that relationship for as long as they live. It is relationships break down, disintegrate because of the poverty of the personality or the being of the two people who enter into the relationship. I thought I would share this insight particularly with young people who are in the process of selecting the spouses, life partners. Be wise about it, be discerning, but above all, everyone who is listening to me, let us acknowledge before God our duty to develop ourselves multifariously to the uttermost, because that indeed is the essence of the spirituality or the spiritual vision that Jesus brought into this world, as nobody else has done before or ever since. So that's my simple idea of love. If love is to endure, then it's absolutely essential that we develop ourselves in a multifarious fashion and attain that higher state of being where we are not limited by cheap, shallow interests and inclinations, including the inclination to exploit each other. It does not have to be said that a relationship in which individuals are exploiting each other cannot endure, and it must not endure. Therefore, I commend these thoughts to you, and I hope that you find this meaningful, and I wish everyone a very blessed life. Thank you.